Yeah, I will. Patrick, will you tell me when it's? Okay. Well, good evening to all of you here in our sanctuary and folks who are watching us online on Facebook, YouTube. If you're watching us live, if you're watching us later on in the day or in the week or whenever you're watching, we're glad you're a part of our study tonight as we continue to look at the life of David. And let's review a little bit of where we were last time. So, if you remember, when David made had his liaison with Bathsheba, and then had his loyal soldier Uriah killed by the enemy intentionally to cover up his adultery, he was told by God through Nathan the prophet, by God, I would have given you much more. I've given you everything. I would have given you much more. But now you're going to have rebellion in your household. You're going to have turmoil within your household. And we start to see that play out, and it started playing out with David's oldest son, Amnon, who was in love, or actually in lust, with his half-sister Tamar. And we talked about last week the terrible story of how Amnon tricks her to coming into his bedchamber, rapes her, and then it says as much as he had wanted her before that, now he hated her and told her to get out. And this is a horrible crime and horrible disgrace to put upon his half-sister. But her full brother was Absalom. Remember, David has multiple wives, and so he has sons and daughters that are, some of them are full sisters and brothers, some of them are half sisters and brothers. And so when Amnon rapes Tamar's full brother Absalom, at first doesn't say anything, neither good nor bad, keeps quiet, waits 2 years to carry out his revenge on his half-brother. But he waits 2 years, and then at an opportune time during a feast, he's arranged for some of his men to kill Amnon. And so that's what happened. Absalom kills his brother Amnon in revenge for Amnon's rape of Absalom's sister. Then Absalom flees because, of course, now he's a murderer. And at first, David gets the news that all of his sons have been killed by Absalom. He gets a false report. Then he gets the true report. No, your other sons are fine, but your son Absalom has killed your son Amnon and has fled and is out of the country now. And so he fled to Geshur, which is where his mother's family was from, because David had married a princess from that region. And so Absalom flees back to his grandfather's area. And we finished up at the end of 2 Samuel 13 last week, where it says this, in 13:37, we ended up, Absalom fled and went to Talmai, son of Amminahud, the king of Geshur. So that's his mother's family. But King David mourned for his son every day. After Absalom fled and went to Geshur, he stayed there 3 years. And the spirit of the king longed to go to Absalom, for he was consoled concerning Amnon's death. So we have this horrible family tragedy. One son has committed a horrible crime against his half-sister. The brother has killed his half-brother and now fled. And David is doubly grieved. He's lost one son who was the eldest, who was the first in line to become the next king. And now the one after him, the next in line, because the second son apparently has died. We don't hear any more about his second son. So Amnon, his firstborn, the second son is nowhere to be seen. He's apparently died. Absalom is the third son. He would now be the next in line to inherit the throne from David. But now he's fled into exile. And David is mourning not only for the son he's lost to murder, but the son he's lost to exile. And that's where we pick up chapter 14. Excuse me, didn't want to blow your ears out. So Joab, chapter 14. Joab, remember Joab is David's nephew and his general, the head of his army. Joab, son of Zeruiah, knew that the king's heart longed for Absalom. He knew how much David missed his son. So Joab sent someone to Tekoa and had a wise woman brought from there. He said to her, "Pretend you are in mourning. Dress in mourning clothes, and don't use any cosmetic lotions. Act like a woman who has spent many days grieving for the dead. Then go to the king and speak these words to him." And Joab put the words in her mouth. So Joab finds a woman, tells her to pretend that she's in mourning, and then tells her what she is to say to King David. And so that's what this woman from Tekoa does. In verse 4, the woman from Tekoa went to the king. She fell with her face to the ground and to pay him honor and said, "Help me, O king." And the king asked her, "What is troubling you?" She said, "I am indeed a widow. My husband is dead. I, your servant, had 2 sons. They got into a fight with each other in the field, and no one was there to separate them. One struck the other and killed him. Now the whole clan has risen up against your servant. They say, 'Hand over the one who struck his brother down, so that we may put him to death for the life of his brother whom he killed. Then we will get rid of the heir as well.' They would put out the only burning coal I have left, leaving my husband neither name nor descendant on the face of the earth." So the woman tells a story, which is a made-up story. And this is reminiscent of what Nathan did. And when Nathan went to David, remember he said there was a man who had many flocks, and then there was a poor fellow who had one little sheep, and he spun the whole story for David until David said, "Well, the rich man who took the one sheep from his poor neighbor, that man deserves to die." And remember Nathan then says, "David, you're the man." And that was, he helped David to see his guilt by telling him a story. Well, here, that's what Joab has now told this woman to do, to tell the king a story. And in the story, the woman says, "I'm a widow. I had 2 sons. They got into a fight. One of my sons killed his brother. That left me with just one son. And now all the family is demanding that he be put to death as a murderer. And if that happens, I won't have any sons. I will have lost my husband. I will have lost both sons. And I will lose everything, because a woman could not own property. A woman could not own property. So if she lost both of her sons, one of her distant male relatives would be able to take all of her property, and she would be left without any support. She'd be left without a son. She'd be left without any land. She'd be left without any property. So she tells this story of desperation to the king. Remember, it's not only the king, he's the chief judge in the land. And she says, if they kill my son, not only will I be bereft of sons, I'll lose everything. I'll be penniless. I'll have nothing. And so she pleads with David to overrule this group that wants her son executed for murder, so that she will not lose everything. So she tells him this story, and it says, the king, verse 8, the king said to the woman, "Go home, and I will issue an order in your behalf." But the woman from Tekoa said to him, "My lord the king, let the blame rest on me and on my father's family, and let the king and his throne be without guilt." The king replied, "If anyone says anything to you, bring him to me, and he won't bother you again." She said, "Then let the king invoke the Lord his God to prevent the avenger of blood from adding to the destruction, so that my son will not be destroyed." She keeps piling on, but what if they come and they still want to take my son away and execute him as a murderer? David says, "No, I as the king am saying he will not be killed. He will not be killed for this death. And he says, at the end there, verse 11, as surely as the Lord lives, not one hair of your son's head will fall to the ground. Then the woman said, let your servant speak a word to my lord the king. So after she's got him to say, no, 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 your son should not be executed for killing his brother, she says, let me say something to you. Speak, he replied. The woman said, why then have you devised a thing like this against the people of God? When the king says this, does he not convict himself? For the king has not brought back his banished son. Like water spilled on the ground, which cannot be recovered, so we must die. But God does not take away life. Instead, he devises ways so that a banished person may not remain estranged from him. So she has tried, well, actually what Joab has now devised and put into her mouth is creating a story that David is now supposed to see as a parable of his own situation. David has a son who's killed his brother. David has exiled that son. That son is no longer at court, no longer welcome in Israel. He's living in a foreign land. And the woman is saying, in my story, you said the brother who killed his brother should be exonerated. So why won't you pardon Absalom? Why won't you do that? Now, of course, you see, Nathan's story, Nathan the prophet, his story was much more fitting. A wealthy man took away the little lamb from the poor man and slaughtered it, and, that's so unjust. And Nathan said, and that's what you've done to Uriah. You've taken his wife and killed him. Well, here the woman has said, I have these two sons, and if they're both dead, I'm penniless, and I have no one to support me. Well, David has other sons. It's not like, well, if David dies, there'll be nobody left to succeed him. There'll be no sons left. He has a multitude of other sons. So the analogy doesn't quite fit. But David is now been presented with this idea. Well, why can't, Absalom was justified in killing, his brother because his brother was a rapist. And why won't you pardon Absalom and let him come home and let him come back to Israel and let him come back into your family? So, this woman continues, verse 15, and now I have come to say this to my lord the king, because the people have made me afraid. Your servant thought, I will speak to the king. Perhaps he'll do what his servant asks. Perhaps the king will agree to deliver his servant from the hand of the man who's trying to cut off both me and my son from the inheritance God gave us. And now your servant says, may the word of my lord the king bring me rest. For my lord the king is like an angel of God in discerning good and evil. May the Lord your God be with you. So she says, King David, your wisdom is like an angel. You always do the right thing. So now, will you do the right thing and allow your son to come home? And then the king, David, says to her in verse 18, the king said to the woman, do not keep from me the answer of what I'm going to ask you. Let the Lord my king speak, the woman said. The king asked, isn't the hand of Joab with you in all of this? David realizes where this has come from, that this is not this woman's idea, that this is not this woman speaking for the population coming to him, going, when will you let Prince Absalom come home? David is able to figure out pretty quickly that Joab is the one behind this, which we're to assume that Joab has been lobbying David to let Absalom return to Israel and come out of exile. So David smells this and says, is Joab the one who put you up to this? And the woman answered, as surely as you live, my lord the king, no one can turn to the right or to the left anything my lord the king says. Yes, it was your servant Joab who instructed me to do this, and who put all these words into the mouth of your servant. Your servant Joab did this to change the present situation. My Lord has wisdom like that of an angel of God. He knows everything that happens in the land. Again, she's buttering him up. Oh, David, you're so wise. You got me. Yes, you figured it out. You're right. It's Joab. Joab is the one who told me to say this to you because nothing escapes your notice. And I know you are so wise. You're like an angel. I know that you will do the right thing. Verse 21. So the king now says to Joab, very well, I'll do it. Go bring back the young man Absalom. So David has now been convinced to allow Absalom, his son, to come back out of exile and to come back into Israel. So Joab, verse 22, Joab fell with his face to the ground to pay him honor. He blessed the king. Joab said, today your servant knows that he has found favor in your eyes, my lord the king, because the king has granted his servant's request. Joab had been lobbying for this, and now David has finally agreed to it. Then Joab said, verse 23, Joab went to Geshur and brought Absalom back to Jerusalem. But, verse 24, but the king said, he must go to his own house. He must not see my face. So Absalom went to his own house and did not see the face of the king. So David says, well, all right. He can come back. He can come back to Jerusalem, but he can't come back to the palace. He can't come back into the family. He can't come back into my presence. He can come back and he can stay at his own house, but I'm not going to see him. I'm not going to welcome him back. He can stay in his own house, but he can't come to the palace. Now, we're told by the author, verse 25, in all Israel there was not a man so highly praised for his handsome appearance as Absalom. From the top of his head to the sole of his foot there was no blemish in him. Whenever he cut the hair of his head, he used to cut his hair from time to time when it became too heavy for him, he would weigh it, and its weight was 200 shekels, which is about 5 pounds. So he's got a lot of hair. By the royal standard. So every year he'd cut off about 5 pounds of hair. 3 sons and a daughter were born to Absalom, and the daughter's name was Tamar, named after his sister, the one who had been raped by Amnon. And she was a beautiful woman. Absalom lived 2 years in Jerusalem without seeing the king's face. Then Absalom sent for Joab in order to send him to the king. So after 2 years, Absalom is like, what am I doing here? I want to see my father. I want to be back at court. I want to be with my family. So he sends for Joab, who has acted as the mediator and the go-between between him and David. So he sends for Joab in order to send him to the king, but Joab refused to come to him. So he sent a second time, but he refused to come. Then he said to his servants, look, Joab's field is next to mine, and he has barley there. Go set it on fire. So Absalom's servants set the field on fire. Then Joab did go to Absalom's house, and he said to him, why have your servants set my field on fire? Absalom said, look, I sent word for you and said, come here so I can send you to the king. In other words, I had to get your attention somehow. I finally got you to come and see me. I guess I had to burn your crops down to get you to come to my house. So after burning down Joab's field, Joab finally comes to see him. And he says, come here so I can send you to the king, and ask, why have I come from Geshur? It'd be better for me if I were still there. Now then, I want to see the king's face. And if I'm guilty of anything, let him put me to death. So Absalom was like, I didn't come back just to sit in my house. I want to go see the king. I want to be back at court. I want to be at the palace. Go tell my father to either bring me back or kill me. You know, if he's going to execute me for killing Amnon, then okay, do that. But it doesn't do me any good to just sit here. So Joab went to the king and told him this. And the king summoned Absalom And he came in and bowed down with his face to the ground before the king, and the king kissed Absalom. So they are now reunited. All is forgiven. They're all reunited, happy, everything's fine. Except, of course, it's not. Because Absalom has a plan. And remember, Absalom is a man who already executed a plan that he took 2 years to plan, the murder of Amnon. Absalom took 2 years plotting how to kill his brother in revenge for the rape of his sister. So now he has another plan, and he's going to put this plan into action. In the course of time, Absalom provided himself with a chariot and horses and with 50 men to run ahead of him. In other words, to make a show of his princeliness. He would get up early and stand by the side of the road leading to the city gate, which that's the place where everybody congregates. That's the place where often the older men would sit and make decisions, or, it'd be like McDonald's today. Where the older men sit and discuss the world. He would go sit by the side of the road leading to the city gate. Whenever anyone came with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, remember David is kind of like the Supreme Court. He's the ultimate judge for the cases that come to him. Whenever someone would come with a complaint to be placed before the king for a decision, Absalom would call out to him, "What town are you from?" And he would answer, "Your servant is from one of the tribes of Israel." Then Absalom would say to him, "Look, your claims are valid and proper, but there is no representative of the king to hear you." And Absalom would add, "If only I were appointed judge in the land, then everyone who has a complaint or a case would come to me, and I would see that he gets justice." Sounds like a political ad, doesn't it? If only I was in charge, everybody would get what they want. If only I was in charge, everyone who brought a case to me would get justice. Unfortunately, that's not happening now. There's nobody to hear your case now. If I were in charge, you'd get justice. Also, whenever anyone approached him to bow down before him, Absalom would reach out his hand, take hold of him, and kiss him. Absalom behaved this way towards all the Israelites who came to the king asking for justice. And so he stole the hearts of the men of Israel. Men would come to him, and because he's the prince, they'd start to bow down. "Oh, no, you don't need to bow down to me. Here, give me a hug. I'm a man of the people." And thus he won the hearts of the men of Israel. Plus the fact he's the best-looking man in the country. It says he's perfect. He's incredibly handsome and charismatic and scheming and plotting. At the end of 4 years, he's also patient. At the end of 4 years, Absalom said to the king, "Let me go to Hebron and fulfill a vow I made to the Lord. While your servant was living at Geshur in Aram, I made this vow: if the Lord takes me back to Jerusalem, I'll worship the Lord in Hebron." And remember, Hebron was where the capital was before they took Jerusalem, before they made Jerusalem the capital. Hebron is in Judah, which was where David ruled when he was just the king of Judah before he became the king of all the nation. So he says, "Let me go down to Hebron and worship God." And the king said, "Go in peace." And he went to Hebron. Then Absalom sent, remember, this is 4 years of him buttering people up. Absalom sent secret messengers throughout the tribes of Israel to say, "As soon as you hear the sound of the trumpets, say, 'Absalom is king in Hebron.'" 200 men from Jerusalem had accompanied Absalom. They'd been invited as guests and went quite innocently, knowing nothing about the matter. While Absalom was offering sacrifices, he also sent for Ahithophel, the Gilonite, David's counselor, to come from Gilo, his hometown. And so the conspiracy gained strength, and Absalom's following kept on increasing. And now it's about to all fall apart. A messenger came and told David, "The hearts of the men of Israel are with Absalom." David said to his officials who were with him in Jerusalem, "Come, we must flee, or none of us will escape from Absalom. We must leave immediately, or he will move quickly to overtake us and bring ruin upon us and put the city to the sword." The king's officials answered him, "Your servants are ready to do whatever the Lord, the king, chooses." The king set out. So David realizes, if we even wait a minute, we're all dead. We're all dead. We got to abandon ship. We got to get out of here. We got to leave Jerusalem. We got to leave the palace because we're all dead if Absalom catches us now. The king set out with his entire household following him, but he left 10 concubines to take care of the palace. So the king set out with all the people following him, all of his people who were loyal to him. And they halted at a place some distance away. All his men marched past him, along with all the Kerethites and the Pelethites and 600 Gittites who'd accompanied him from Gath, marched before the king. And the king said to Ittai, the Gittite, "Why should you come along with us? Go back and stay with King Absalom." Notice how he refers to him already, King Absalom. "You're a foreigner, an exile from your homeland. You only came here yesterday. And today shall I make you wander about with us when I don't know where I'm going? Go back, take your countrymen. May kindness and faithfulness be with you." Well, here's a guy that's just recently come into his service, just become one of his guards. He's like, you just got here. You don't have to go into, hiding with me and risk your life. Just go back to your own people. Go back to Jerusalem and serve my son or whatever. You don't need to do this. But Ittai replied to the king, "As surely as the Lord lives, and as my lord the king lives, wherever my lord the king may be, whether it means life or death, there will your servant be." He's going to stick with him. He's loyal to him. David said to Ittai, Go ahead, march on." So Ittai the Gittite marched on with all his men and the families that were with him. The whole countryside wept aloud as all the people passed by. The king also crossed the Kidron Valley, and all the people moved on towards the desert. Zadok was there too. He's one of the priests. And all the Levites who were with him were carrying the Ark of the Covenant of God. They set down the Ark of God, and Abiathar offered sacrifices until all the people had finished leaving the city. So 2 of the priests are with him, Zadok and Abiathar. Then the king said to Zadok, "Take the Ark of God back to the city. If I find favor in the Lord's eyes, he'll bring me back and let me see it and his dwelling place again. If he says I'm not pleased with you, then I'm ready. Let him do to me whatever seems good to him." So he's not going to take the ark with him. He just had it with him as they were making their exit. He tells the priest, "You all go back. They're not going to kill you. They wouldn't dare kill you. So you go back, take the ark back, and if God wants me back on the throne, he'll make it happen. If God is displeased with me, then that's up to God." The king also said to Zadok the priest, "Aren't you a seer? Go back to the city in peace with your son Ahimaaz and Jonathan, son of Abiathar." These are both the 2 sons of the 2 priests. "You and Abiathar take your 2 sons with you. I'll wait at the fords in the desert until word comes from you to inform me." So Zadok and Abiathar took the Ark of God back to Jerusalem and stayed there. So David tells his 2 priests, "You guys both have a son. They need to be the messengers, and you need to be able to send me word of what is happening so that I know where to run, what to do, what's going on. And here, I'll wait here. You use your sons as messengers to tell me the situation." But David continued up the Mount of Olives, weeping as he went. His head was covered and he was barefoot. In other words, he's going in mourning. He's going showing he is broken. All the people with him covered their heads too and were weeping as they went. Now David had been told, Ahithophel is among the conspirators with Absalom. Now Ahithophel was one of David's closest advisors, one of the guys who was there to give him advice. And this is somewhat surprising that he would go with Absalom, that he would switch so quickly to Absalom. So David prayed, "O Lord, turn Ahithophel's counsel into foolishness." So Ahithophel is a smart guy, but David prays, this time, let him give bad advice. When David arrived at the summit where people used to worship God, Hushai, the Archite, was there to meet him, his robe torn and dust on his head. David said to him, "If you go with me, you'll be a burden to me. If you return to the city and say to Absalom, 'I'll be your servant, O king. I was your father's servant in the past. Now I'll be your servant,' then you can help me by frustrating Ahithophel's advice. Won't the priests Zadok and Abiathar be there with you? Tell them anything you hear in the king's palace. Their 2 sons, Ahimaaz son of Zadok and Jonathan son of Abiathar, are there with them. Send them to me with anything you hear." So David's friend Hushai arrived at Jerusalem as Absalom was entering the city. So you see what David has a friend, a close friend. And he says, "I'll go with you, David." And David says, "No, here's what I need you to do. I need you to be my mole. I need you to be my spy. You go back, you pretend to side with Absalom. But in reality, you're my spy. You tell the priests what you know. They'll tell their sons will come and tell me." And he says, also, you are there to contradict the advice of Ahithophel. If Ahithophel gives Absalom good advice, it's your job to try to persuade Absalom to do the opposite. So he is there in a dangerous position, working for David, but pretending to be now loyal to Absalom. Now, David is continuing to head towards the Jordan. David had gone a short distance beyond the summit. There was Ziba, the steward of Mephibosheth. Okay, remember this guy? Way back when David said, "Is there anybody left from the family of Jonathan that I can treat well, that I can give some help to, that I can show kindness to?" And they said, "Well, there's Mephibosheth, who was Jonathan's son, the one who's crippled in his feet," they told us every time. And so they find this fellow Ziba, who was a servant in the house of Saul. And David told Ziba, "You are to manage Mephibosheth's lands for him. You and your family manage his property so that he'll have an income. But Mephibosheth is going to sit at my table, and I'm going to take care of him." So this is Mephibosheth's servant, Ziba. And Mephibosheth, remember, is the son of Jonathan, David's best friend. So as he's going out, there is Ziba, steward of Mephibosheth, waiting to meet him. He had a string of donkeys saddled and loaded with 200 loaves of bread, 100 cakes of raisins, 100 cakes of figs, and a skin of wine. The king asked Ziba, "Why have you brought these?" Ziba answered, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride on. The bread and the fruit are for the men to eat. The wine is to refresh those who've become exhausted in the desert." The king asked, "Where is your master's grandson?" Your master is Saul. So Saul's grandson is Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. "Where's your master's grandson, Mephibosheth?" Ziba said to him, "He's staying in Jerusalem because he thinks today the house of Israel will give me back my grandfather's kingdom." Well, Mephibosheth, he's there thinking this is now his moment, that the house of Saul will be once again he'll be installed as the new king. And the king says to Ziba, "All that belonged to Mephibosheth is now yours." How likely do you think it is that Ziba is telling the truth here? Highly unlikely. But he gets what he wants. Because remember, he has been managing Mephibosheth's properties. And he says to David, oh, Mephibosheth, yeah, he thinks he's going to be the next king. And David says to Ziba, all right, well, you get all of his land. Which, I assume, and I'm not alone, and scholars often assume, this whole thing is a made-up story. That Mephibosheth, by this time, knew he didn't have any chance at all of becoming king. Not against somebody like Absalom. So this is a ploy by Ziba to get the property away from Mephibosheth. But David falls for it. I humbly bow, Ziba said. May I find favor in your eyes, my lord and king. We'll come back to him later, to Ziba. Now, David is still leaving, getting away from Jerusalem, heading towards the Jordan. As King David approached Baharim, a man from the same clan as Saul's family came out from there. Remember, Saul was part of the tribe of Benjamin. His name was Shimei, son of Gera, and he cursed as he came out. And remember, that doesn't mean he was using bad language, like using what we would call curse words. We're talking about literally cursing. May you die in the desert. May all your children starve to death. May, a curse, putting a curse on him, not just saying bleep, bleep, bleep. He's putting curses on David. He cursed as he came out. He pelted David and all the king's officials with stones, though all the troops and the special guard were on David's right and left. As he cursed, Shimei said, get out, you man of blood, you scoundrel. The Lord has repaid you for all the blood you shed in the household of Saul, in whose place you have reigned. The Lord has handed the kingdom over to your son Absalom. You've come to ruin because you were a man of blood. So this is what this fellow is saying to David. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, remember that's Joab's brother, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over and cut off his head. Because you got hundreds of people, including all these military guys surrounding David, and you got this one guy running along beside them, throwing rocks at him and screaming at him and cursing, and Joab's brother's like, let me just go kill this guy. Let me just go cut this guy's head off. Why are you letting this guy get away with cursing you like that? But the king said, what do you and I have in common, you sons of Zeruiah? This is as in, the two, Joab and his brother. If he's cursing because the Lord said to him, curse David, who can ask, why do you do this? And maybe he's supposed to be cursing me. He's not. He's just going to let him talk. David said to Abishai and all his officials, my son, who is of my own flesh, is trying to take my life. How much more than this Benjamite? Leave him alone. Let him curse. For the Lord's told him to. It may be that the Lord will see my distress and repay me with good for the cursing I'm receiving today. In other words, maybe this is supposed to happen. Leave him alone. Just leave him alone. So David and his men continued along the road while Shimei was going along the hillside opposite him, cursing as he went and throwing stones at him and showering him with dirt. Which is very irritating. To have somebody throwing rocks and dirt at you and cursing at you as you walk along. The king and all the people with him arrived at their destination exhausted, and there he refreshed himself. So David and his loyal to him, they're getting farther and farther away from Jerusalem. Meanwhile, back in Jerusalem, Absalom and all the men of Israel came to Jerusalem. And Ahithophel, remember, this is the guy, the good advice guy, Ahithophel was with him. Then Hushai, the Archite, David's friend, went to Absalom and said to him, long live the king, long live the king. Remember, this is the spy. Absalom asked Hushai, is this the love you show your friend? Why didn't you go with your friend? Well, Absalom is suspicious. Why would David's good friend Hushai come to me? Why isn't he with David? I thought they were close. But Hushai is also a clever man. Hushai said to Absalom, verse 18, "No, the one chosen by the Lord, by these people, and by all the men of Israel. His I will be. I'll remain with him. Furthermore, whom should I serve? Should I not serve the son? Just as I served your father, so I will serve you." And Absalom, so he's like, "Oh, no, I'm with you, Absalom. I'm just like I was with your father. You know, the people have chosen you. That's what the people want. Give the people what they want. I'm with you." Of course, he's lying through his teeth, but he convinces Absalom to trust him. So Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give us your advice. What should we do?" And Ahithophel answered, "Lie with your father's concubines, whom he left to take care of the palace. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself a stench in your father's nostrils, and the hands of everyone with you will be strengthened." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and he lay with his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. If you remember, go back to 2 Samuel 12 for a minute. When David has sinned with Bathsheba, remember, this is what the message Nathan the prophet delivered to David. 2 Samuel 12, starting at verse 11. This is what the Lord says, "Out of your own household I'm going to bring calamity upon you. Before your very eyes I will take your wives and give them to one who's close to you, and he will lie with your wives in broad daylight. You did it in secret. I will do this thing in broad daylight before all Israel." So that's what Nathan said was going to happen to David, and indeed now it does happen. His son Absalom publicly sleeps with his harem. And you can say, well, and this is not a matter of sexual desire. This is not lust. This is a political statement saying the breach between me and my father cannot be smoothed over. This is an act by sleeping with his father's harem that there's no turning back. There's no chance now of him ever being resolved. There's no chance of a treaty or a family coming back together. This is making him a stench in his father's nostrils. So he does this, and it says they set up a tent and, do it in public. Now, how literally we're talking about him doing this in public is a little bit, we're not real clear on it when we're talking about doing this in public, exactly how public is it. But that's what he does, and everyone in the country knows that that's what he's doing. Now it says, now in those days, verse 23, we're back in chapter 16. In those days, the advice Ahithophel gave was like that of one who inquires of God. And that is how both David and Absalom regarded all of Ahithophel's advice. So Ahithophel is a brilliant guy. It's like, if he said it, you better do it. And, this was a way of Absalom saying, I have cut all ties with my father. And so Absalom now is telling, Ahithophel is now telling Absalom what he should do next. Chapter 17. Ahithophel said to Absalom, "I would choose 12,000 men and set out tonight in pursuit of David. I would attack him while he's weary and weak. I would strike him with terror, and then all the people with him will flee. I would strike down only the king and bring all the people back to you. The death of the man you seek will mean the return of all. All the people will be unharmed." This plan seemed good to Absalom and to all the elders of Israel. So Ahithophel gives Absalom good advice, because this is exactly what Absalom should do if he wants to be king. He should immediately go after David and strike him down and kill him right then. So Ahithophel is brilliant and gives him good advice. But Absalom said, well, summon also Hushai the Archite, so we may hear what he has to say, David's friend. When Hushai came to him, Absalom said, well, Ahithophel has given me this advice. Should we do what he says? If not, give us your opinion. And here is where Hushai puts on a command performance of making terrible advice sound like good advice. Hushai's job now is to give Absalom terrible advice but make him think he's giving him good advice. Hushai replied to Absalom, "The advice Ahithophel has given you is not good this time. You know your father and his men, they're fighters, and as fierce as a wild bear robbed of her cubs. Besides, your father is an experienced fighter. He will not spend the night with the troops. Even now, he's hidden in a cave or some other place. If he should attack your troops first, whoever hears about it will say, 'There's been a slaughter among the troops who follow Absalom.' Then even the bravest soldier, whose heart is like the heart of a lion, will melt with fear. For all Israel knows that your father is a fighter, and that those who are with him are brave. So I advise you, let all Israel from Dan to Beersheba," which is like from one end of the country to the next, "as numerous as the sand on the seashore, be gathered to you, with you yourself leading them into battle. Then we will attack him wherever he may be found, and will fall on him as the dew settles on the ground. Neither he nor any of his men will be left alive. If he withdraws to a city, then all Israel will bring ropes to that city and will drag it down to the valley until not even a piece of it can be found." Now, this is terrible advice. This is like, we're going to wait until we can gather this huge army. We're going to wait and wait and wait until, and then we're going to try to go kill not just David, but all of his men, and we're going to chase him all over the country and tear down towns if we have to. This is terrible advice, but Hushai makes it sound, well, you know your father, and he makes it sound, and Absalom falls for it. Absalom, verse 14, Absalom and all the men of Israel said, "The advice of Hushai the Archite is better than that of Ahithophel." For the Lord had determined to frustrate the good advice of Ahithophel in order to bring disaster on Absalom. So Absalom follows the terrible advice of the spy. So Hushai told Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, "Ahithophel has advised Absalom and the elders of Israel to do such and such, but I've advised them to do so and so. Now, send a message immediately and tell David, don't spend the night at the fords in the desert, cross over without fail, or the king and all the people with him will be swallowed up." So the plan works. Hushai tells the priests tell their sons, the sons run and tell David. Jonathan and Ahimaaz were staying in Rogel. A servant girl was to go and inform them. And they were to go and tell King David, for they could not risk being seen entering the city. But a young man saw them and told Absalom. So the two of them left quickly and went to the house of a man in Bahurim. He had a well in his courtyard, and they climbed down into it. His wife took a covering and spread it out over the opening of the well and scattered grain over it. No one knew anything about it. So when Absalom's men came to the woman at the house, they said, "Where are Ahimaaz and Jonathan?" The woman said, "Oh, they crossed over the brook." The men searched but found no one and returned to Jerusalem. So narrowly the two messengers avoid capture. After the men had gone, the two climbed out of the well, went to inform King David, and they said to him, "Set out and cross the river at once. Ahithophel has advised such and such against you." And David and all the people with him set out and crossed the Jordan, and by daybreak no one was left who had not crossed the Jordan. So Absalom follows Hushai's advice. When Ahithophel, the brilliant strategy expert, when Ahithophel saw that his advice had not been followed, he saddled his donkey and set out for his house in his hometown. He put his house in order and then hanged himself. So he died and was buried in his father's tomb. And this is not just wounded pride that they didn't take his advice. He sees the writing on the wall. Okay, Absalom is taking this terrible advice. His coup is going to fail, and I'll be executed for helping Absalom, so I'm just going to go kill myself now instead of waiting to be killed later. So he goes and commits suicide. David went to Mahanaim, and Absalom crossed the Jordan with all the men of Israel. Absalom had appointed Amasa over the army in place of Joab, because of course Joab was with David. And Amasa was a son of a man named Jether, an Israelite who had married Abigail, the daughter of Nahash and sister of Zeruiah, the mother of Joab. So he's in somehow the extended family of Joab. The Israelites and Absalom camped in the land of Gilead. So when David came to Mahanaim, Shobi, son of Nahash, from Rabbah of the Ammonites, and Machir, son of Amiel, from Lodabar, and Barzillai of the Gilead, from Rogalim, brought bedding and bowls and articles of pottery, and they brought wheat and barley and flour and grain and beans and lentils and honey and curds and sheep and cheese from cow's milk for David and his people to eat. And they said, the people have become hungry and are tired and thirsty in the desert. So David has a lot of support. Unfortunately, this is now turning into civil war. So David has support, and some of the wealthy men of the area bring him and his men provisions, bring them food. Absalom has some of the people in Israel who are with him. David has a lot of support from other people who, he's been king for many, many years now, and he's won many battles and driven out the Philistines. But of course, people's memories are short. But David still does have a lot of people loyal to him. So we're on the brink of civil war, father versus son. David mustered the men who were with him and appointed over them commanders of thousands and commanders of hundreds. And David sent the troops out, a third under the command of Joab, a third under Joab's brother, Abishai, son of Zeruiah, and a third under Ittai. Remember the guy he said, you've only been with me for a day. You need to go home. But he divides his troops between Joab, Joab's brother, and this other fellow, Ittai. And he says, the king told the troops, I myself will surely march out with you. I'm going to march out with you. Now, David is not a young man by this point, but David says, I'm going to go with you into battle. But the men said, you must not go out. If we're forced to flee, they won't care about us. Even if half of us die, they won't care. You're worth 10,000 of us. It will be better now for you to give us support from the city. So the soldiers, they don't care about us. Their whole point is to kill you. Their whole mission is to kill you, because once you're dead, then Absalom will be able to make his claim to be the rightful king. It's not about how many men they can kill or we can kill. It's all about keeping you alive. The only way that Absalom's coup is going to fail is if you're alive. So you do not go with us into battle. You stay here and support us from the city. And they might be thinking, plus you're getting kind of old, David. And the king said, I'll do whatever seems best to you. So he stays behind. So the king stood beside the gate while all the men marched out in units of hundreds and thousands. And here's where they're heading out to have this big civil war. And they're marching past David. And it says, and the king commanded Joab and Abishai and Ittai, the three generals in charge of the three groups of soldiers, be gentle with the young man Absalom for my sake. You're going out into battle, and the enemy is my son. So, in other words, don't kill him. Don't kill my son. Win the battle, but don't kill my son. All the troops heard the king giving orders concerning Absalom to each of the commanders. Be gentle with the young man Absalom. The army marched into the field to fight Israel. In other words, David's followers are now fighting, quote, Israel, the people under Absalom. And the battle took place in the forest of Ephraim. The battle is taking place not in a desert or a valley. It's taking place in a forest. Not that many of them in Israel, but that's where they are. There, the army of Israel was defeated by David's men, and the casualties that day were great, 20,000 men, which is always the tragedy of a civil war. In our country, more people were killed in the Civil War than any other war in our history. The battle spread out over the whole countryside, and the forest claimed more lives that day than the sword. So the fighting in a forest, there's just all kinds of mishaps. You got horses, and there's just all kinds of problems fighting in this territory. Now, Absalom happened to meet David's men. He was riding his mule, and as the mule went under the thick branches of a large oak, Absalom's head got caught in a tree. Maybe it's all because all that hair. Remember, he's got a lot of bushy hair. He was left hanging in midair while the mule he was riding on kept going. So if you picture this, he's riding on this mule, his head gets caught in a branch, the mule keeps going, so he's literally hanging by his head from a tree. When one of the men saw this, he told Joab, "I just saw Absalom hanging in an oak tree." Joab said to the man who had told him this, "What? You saw him? Why didn't you strike him to the ground right there? Then I've had to give you 10 shekels of silver and a warrior's belt." But the man replied, "Even if 1,000 shekels were weighed out into my hands, I would not lift my hand against the king's son. In our hearing, the king commanded you and Abishai and Ittai protect the young man Absalom for my sake. If I'd put my life in jeopardy, and nothing is hidden from the king, you would have kept your distance from me." Joab said, "I'm not going to wait like this for you." So Joab took 3 javelins in his hand and plunged them into Absalom's heart, while Absalom was still alive in the oak tree. And 10 of Joab's armor bearers surrounded Absalom and struck him and killed him. Now Absalom, Joab knew that this had to be done. As awful as it was, Joab understood what David didn't. There can't be 2 kings. Joab knew that as long as Absalom was alive, there would be unrest, there would be civil war, there would be treachery. He knew that Absalom was a plotter and a schemer. And David, when he said, "Don't kill Absalom," wasn't thinking as the king, he was thinking as a father. Don't kill my son. But Joab knew that David, tragically, David was wrong as king. As king, a traitor, one who led a rebellion against you, one who had slept with your concubines and therefore said there's no going back, there's no reconciliation possible. Joab knew that Absalom had to die. And so Joab, against David's orders, kills Absalom. And Joab sounded the trumpet, and the troops stopped pursuing Israel, and Joab halted them, and he took Absalom, threw him in a big pit in the forest, and piled up a large heap of rocks over him. And meanwhile, all the Israelites fled to their homes. During his lifetime, Absalom had taken a pillar and erected it in the king's valley as a monument to himself, for he thought, "I have no son to carry on the memory of my name," which earlier we were told that he did have a son, but we're not sure what happened to him. He named the pillar after himself, and it's called Absalom's monument to this day. So Joab has now killed Absalom. Now, verse 18:19. Now Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, this is one of the sons of one of the priests, "Let me run and take the news to the king that the Lord has delivered him from the hands of his enemies." In other words, we win. We've won the battle. The other guys are in retreat. We win. Let me go tell David that we won. "You're not the one to take this news today," Joab said to him. "You may take the news another time. You must not do so today, because the king's son is dead." In other words, the king is not going to hear this hip, hip, hooray. You don't want to be the one to go tell him his son is dead, even though we won the battle. The king is not going to hear this well. So Joab said to a Cushite, "Go tell the king what you've seen." And the Cushite bowed down before Joab and ran off to go back and tell David the news. But Ahimaaz, son of Zadok, again said to Joab, "Come what may, please let me run behind the Cushite." He has got ants in his pants to go tell David this news. He just wants to go be the one to tell David. Joab replied, "My son, why do you want to go? You don't have any news that'll bring you a reward. You don't want to be the one to tell him this." And he said, "Well, come what may, I want to run." Joab said, "Run." Then Ahimaaz ran by way of the plain and outran the Cushite. While David was sitting between the inner and the outer gates, the watchman went up to the roof of the gateway by the wall. As he looked out, he saw a man running alone. The watchman called out to the king and reported it. The king said, "If he's alone, he must have good news." And the man came closer and closer. Then the watchman saw another man running, and he called down to the gatekeeper, "Look, there's another man running alone." The king said, "He must be bringing good news too." The watchman said, "It seems to me the first one runs like Ahimaaz, son of Zadok." Isn't it interesting? You can actually sometimes tell people by their gait, or by their walk, or by their run. You know, you don't think about it, but sometimes you see somebody and you can tell just by their walk who it is. And they have a distinctive gait. He says, this guy running, he looks like Ahimaaz. He's a good man, the king said. He comes with good news. Then Ahimaaz called out to the king, "All is well." He bowed down before the king with his face to the ground and said, "Praise be to the Lord your God. He's delivered up the men who lifted their hands against my lord the king." And the king asked, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" Ahimaaz answered, "I saw great confusion. Just as Joab was about to send the king's servant and me, your servant, I don't know what it was." Realizes, maybe I don't want to tell him the news. There was a lot of confusion. I don't know. I don't think I know what happened. Of course he does, but he realized at the last minute this is not the news that he wants to deliver. King said, "Stand aside and wait here." He stepped aside and stood there. Then the Cushite arrived and said, "My lord the king, hear the good news. The Lord has delivered you today from all who rose up against you." And the king asked the Cushite, "Is the young man Absalom safe?" The Cushite replied, "May the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up to harm you be like that young man." In other words, he is dead, dead, dead. The king was shaken. He went up to the room over the gateway and wept. As he went, he said, "Oh, my son, Absalom, my son, Absalom, if only I had died instead of you. Oh, Absalom, my son, my son." So here, as we say, here is David. He has two roles in this story. He has the role of the king. He has the role of a father. And those two roles are in direct conflict with each other. And he wanted to be able to win the war, win the battle, but not kill his son. And Joab, his general, realized that was impossible, that it couldn't be done. So Joab took it into his own hands to kill Absalom. But here, when David hears the news that you've won, the rebellion has been put down, the war is over, they're in retreat, you're safe, he doesn't hear any of it. He doesn't ask about anybody or anything else. He doesn't ask about the rest of his men. How many are my men safe? Were my men killed? He doesn't ask anything else. He only wants to know one thing. What about my son? And the news is he's dead. And then David goes up to his room and starts to wail and weep. My son, my son, my son, it should have been me. My son, my son. And so you think back to when David, where this all started, it all started with David sleeping with Bathsheba. And God saying, you're going to have trouble in your household. But, and of course, but the trouble is not supernaturally visited upon David. The trouble is because David is a great warrior and a good poet with the Psalms, and David loves God. The Bible says David is the man after God's own heart. David passionately loves God, but he's a terrible father. Because when Amnon raped his sister, what did David do about it? Absolutely nothing. David is a terrible father. And because he's a terrible father, all of this, Plus, you may say, well, and of course we're not, there are wonderful parents who have not wonderful kids and vice versa. There are horrible parents who end up having good kids and vice versa. But, you think about, okay, his two eldest sons are both pretty rotten guys. One Amnon who rapes his sister, one Absalom who plots revenge and overthrows his father. These sons obviously were not raised to have any kind of family loyalty. They are both cold, hard, calculating young men. And so David has missed the mark as a father. And, I think about, there are in history a lot of great men, and women, but, we think about great men who accomplish great things and yet whose families fall apart and, who end up with horrible regrets because they have, poured something into one thing, but they've neglected their own families. And that's the case here with David. He neglects his sons and his daughter, and now this is what comes crashing down on him. Now 2 sons dead, 20,000 men dead, and the kingdom teetering on the edge. And that's where we're gonna stop, because next week we'll talk about the fallout from all of this, and we'll head towards the last chapter, or the last stories of David's reign. So let's have a word of prayer. Lord, thankful for your sustaining grace. Lord, in some ways it's when we see how even a man as great as David has failings and falls short, it reminds us that we all fall short, that only Jesus lived a sinless life, that only Jesus was perfect. And even the great men and women of the Bible are flawed just like we are. Lord, this story reminds us of how ambition and cruelty and all kinds of other things can lead to disaster. And so, Lord, keep us from falling into the behaviors that we've read about. And as we think about David as king, be with all who are leaders in our country, as we now are one day removed from an election, that all who are elected would rule and govern wisely, justly, and with an ear to you, listening to your voice as their main advisor, as their main counsel. And we ask that you would continue to watch over us now in your name. Amen.